So in the last lesson, we learned about using the Firebase authentication module to register our very first user, this 1at2.com person. Now we're going to look at the login route. So in this case, it's this screen right here. And we're going to be doing pretty much the same thing as what we did in the register screen. We're going to take the email and password that they've typed in, and in the moment when they press on the login button, we're going to take their details through to Firebase. And we're going to be using a login method to check that email and password against what we've got stored in our Firebase authentication database. And if that was successful, then we're again going to take them straight to the chat view controller. So this is the case where after the user registers for the first time, the next time they use our service, they're always going to be accessing it through the login route. So let's go ahead and tackle this. If we head back to the documentation and we go to authentication, iOS, password authentication, we can skip all the parts that we've already done and head over to the sign in user with an email address and password section. We've already done step 1 and step 2. We now have to move on to step 3. So the method is called sign in with email and password. And again, it takes 2 arguments or inputs. One is the email that they've registered with, and another is the password that they've registered with. And once this closure completes, we end up with an authentication result and an error if there was one. So the user's account data will live in this auth result object that we get back, and we can use it inside this closure block, or we can check to see if there were any errors. Again, I'm going to go ahead and copy this code, making sure that you're copying the Swift code and not the Objective-C code, which will look very strange anyways. And heading back to our app, we're going to go to the login view controller.swift, and we're going to put that code inside the login pressed IB action. So that, of course, relates to this particular button when it gets pressed. And what we want to happen is to trigger this sign in with email and password method. So again, we need to tell this file that we want to use the Firebase module so that we can use the auth object. And we also have to supply an email and password. And I want to quickly pause here and pose a challenge to you. See if you can add the code to retrieve the text that the user typed into the email and the password fields. Then you should only call the sign-in method if neither the email nor the password text is equal to nil. I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video before I show you the solution. Ready? Here's the solution. I'm going to do the same thing that we did before to use optional binding to get out the email text and password text. So I'm going to write if let email equals email text field dot text, and then add a comma, and let password equal password text field dot text. And then we're going to wrap all of this authentication code inside a set of curly brackets like so. And now we're ready to tackle this block. And that's the solution to the challenge. The code we wrote is very similar to what we did in the register view controller. Now, you might have noticed that this particular sign-in method actually looks a little bit different from the create user method that we got from Firebase earlier on. And the extra bits are this part, the weak self, and also this guard statement. And this is just a little bit of code that Firebase has actually left in here, which is actually slightly outdated. The latest syntax would look something like this. And what it does is it avoids a retain cycle in the cases where we're actually referring to the view controller within our closure, and we're going to be destroying this view controller before this closure completes. So if you're interested in getting more details on this and why it is that we don't actually need this part or this part in our code, then I've linked to a number of resources for you to check out. And I have to warn you, it's quite complex and the rabbit hole goes quite deep, but I found some resources that explain this topic quite well. So if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, then be sure to check it out. All right, so coming back to our authentication sign-in method, we want to do the same thing that we did before, which is to check if there was an error. So if let e equals error, then in this case, I'm going to simply just print the error. But of course, we could also handle this error by presenting it to the user, in which case we would have to take a look at the reference for fear auth errors to see all of the different error codes, create a switch statement that checks for which one we're getting, and then turn all of those error codes into a message that's useful for the user, and then present it in some sort of alert. Now, in my case, I'm just going to print it out for the developer to see. But if we know that the error is equal to nil, then we can go ahead and add an else statement to proceed with the login process. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the login screen in our navigation stack. So at this point, they've got the welcome screen at the bottom, the login screen next, and then on top of that, we're going to present the next screen, which is the chat view controller. And I want to pose this to you as another challenge. See if you can write the code that navigates the chat view controller when sign-in has been successful. I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video before I show you the solution. Ready? Here's the solution. We're going to navigate to the chat view controller in the same way as we did in the register view controller, which is to perform a segue with a particular identifier. And in our case, that segue is this one, which we named login to chat. So I'm just going to copy it from here to minimize the possibility of typos. And then down here in this else statement, I'm going to say perform segue with identifier, and sender is self. This is the starting point of our segue. And the final thing we have to do is to add the self in front of our perform segue method call. And that's the solution to the challenge. We're now ready to run our app and test it out. So instead of going to the register page, I'm going to go into the login page. And here I'm going to use the credentials that I used previously to register, which is a user with email 1@2.com, and their password was 123456 because 6 is the minimum number of characters I have to supply Firebase with in order for it to accept it as a password. So now my email is going to be 1@2.com and my password 123456, and then I'm going to click login. And as you can see, the login process was successful. I didn't get any error messages, and it performed that segue, taking me to the chat view controller right here. So that's how we log in our users. In the next lesson, we're going to be covering the logout route so that we'll be able to log in users, register users, and also log them out back to the welcome screen. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.